Hi Year 9, as I mentioned when I last saw you, I've decided to make this revision video for you because with teaching all of the 3 Year 9 groups, especially at the moment, I know it's really hard for some of you that have missed time at school. You've been home for a little bit, then back in for a little bit, then home again, and I know that a few of you were feeling as though you were going to find this first exam quite tricky, so I thought I'd record this video for you, first of all, going over what the exam's going to look like. If you were in last week, we have already done this together in class, so I'm just going to go over that again, what each question's going to look like. We'll look at some model questions and you'll think about how you would answer them. Then we'll look at some model answers, and then for the second part of this video I'm going to do some revision with you. Some of the revision is going to be completely independent, so you'll be able to do some of it not whilst watching this video, just at home at your own time, and all of that will be on Teams. Some of the revision that you'll need for your exam that I'm going to focus on in this lesson is nationalism, because quite a few of you were saying that you felt like out of the 4 long-term causes of war, it was nationalism that you struggled with most in your assessment a couple of weeks ago. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the second half. So this video might be quite long, and that's fine. You don't have to watch it all in one go, you can stagger it, but the first part is going to be focused on what the exam questions are going to look like, and then the second part is going to be focused on some content. So you can see here that I have typed up some instructions for you, and again this is all going on Teams and on class charts as well. So this is how I want you to break up your revision. So first thing I want you to make sure that you have done is, over the past few weeks you've been completing weekly revision tasks. Everybody needs to be up to week 4, not including week 3. So if you are behind with those, that's the first thing that I want you to do. The second thing I want you to focus on is a task that I've set on Teams called Look, Cover, Write, Check. So you set a timer on your phone, you read the information that I've put on Teams, and you keep reading it until your timer finishes. Once the timer beeps after 5 minutes, you get rid of the information, and you either use the blank table that I gave some of you that you have in your book, or if you didn't get a blank table, just draw out a new one, and then you rewrite as much information you can remember from the text. Again, with just 5 minutes timer set on your phone. Once your timer beeps, you go back and you check the text again and you add anything you've missed. Then on Teams, I'm going to set a World War I revision quiz that I'd like you to complete. And then also there's this YouTube video here. So there's lots of different things you do over half term. You can do all of it if you want to, or you can pick and choose certain bits of it, okay? Any questions, then obviously email me, but all of this will be going on Teams. So, first of all, preparations. What is your exam going to look like? So your exam, which we are completing after half term, is going to have 4 questions on it, and you'll be given an hour and 15 minutes to complete this in exam conditions. So no book, no plan, no revision guide, no information in front of you. You are doing this completely from memory. The 4 questions are going to be based on World War I and the causes of World War I, as obviously that is the topic that we have been studying. In your exam, you're going to answer 2 4-mark questions, 1 8-mark question and 1 16-mark question, and we're going to go through those now. So first of all, question 1 will be your 8-mark question. This is a utility question. You'll be given 2 sources. These are contemporary sources from the time period. You need to look at both of them and you need to explain why they are useful to us as historians and what we can learn from them. The second questions are kind of like, they're 2 and 3, but they're sort of like part A, part B, so they kind of come as a pair, and they're 4 marks each. These are a how and a why question. So how are they different and why are they different? This time you're going to be studying 2 historical interpretations. These are different to sources. Sources are contemporary, they're from the time period, whereas historical interpretations are what we would call secondary sources. That means they've been written after the time period by historians. These are opinions of why World War I started from experts on the topic. First of all, you need to explain how the interpretations differ. So interpretation 1 says this caused World War I, whereas interpretation 2 says this. They'll always say different things. Then, for the second part, so the next 4 marker, you're explaining why they differ. So, it's different to the first one. Instead, you're looking a little bit deeper and explaining why they have reached the conclusion that they have reached. That tends to be the trickier one out of the 2. We'll come back to that. Last one, your big question. This is a 16-mark question, so you should be spending most of your time on this question. This is an interpretation question based on the interpretations that you've already used in the previous 2 questions. You need to write a balanced answer that uses evidence from the interpretations to support the points that you are making. You need to weigh up evidence for and against the interpretations as well, and then reach a judgment. So you're not using the contemporary sources from question 1, instead you're using the historical interpretations and you're explaining to what extent you agree with them. You must have a clear line of argument. To what extent do you agree with this interpretation? Again, we'll look over the structure of that in a little bit more detail. So, question 1, utility question. They're always structured like this. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into ... Obviously, we have been studying World War I, so they're only going to be contemporary sources on World War I and the causes of World War I. So these are the 3 sections you need to consider when studying utility. First of all, you need to consider the provenance of a source, which sounds like a scarier word than it actually is. All that means is origin. Where has it come from? What is it? Literally. Is it a painting? Is it a photograph? Is it from a diary? Is it a cartoon? Has it been taken from a newspaper or official war documents? So literally its origin. What is it? When was it produced? Was it produced in a certain year, in a certain time period? What is its purpose? Has it been made to influence? Has it been made to make people feel emotional? Has it been made to make people sign up for war? That kind of thing. So, literally, what is it? Where's it come from? And why that is useful to us as historians. That is the main focus of this question. Why is it useful? What can we learn from it? What do we know from our own knowledge? You must always link. So the provenance of source A is this. This is useful because I know from my own knowledge. So make sure you're constantly making those links. Next part is content. This just means, what does the source say? So if it's a written source, can you take a quote from it? If it is a photograph or a drawing, tell me what you can see. And then again, explain why that makes a source useful. So, source B is a photograph showing X, Y, and Z. This is useful to me because I know from my own knowledge. Or, source B is a statement taken from Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. This is useful because he says this, give a quote. This is useful because I know from my own knowledge. So you are taking extracts from the source, writing it down as a quote or telling me what you can see if you can't quote it, and then same as previously, this makes the source useful because, and this is useful because I know from my own knowledge. You are constantly relating the primary source to what you know to be historically true. And the last part, this should not be the main focus of your question. Nobody should be writing anything along the lines of the source being useless or that it's not very good, we can't learn from it, because that's just not true. The examiners will always give you sources that are useful to us, even if they are very unreliable, even if they are biased, we can always learn from them, so don't fall into that trap. However, you might maybe look at the source and you might maybe notice that it could be slightly limited. What I mean by that is, perhaps maybe it's not showing the full side of the picture. Perhaps maybe it's leaving certain details out. Perhaps maybe its provenance might be limited. That'll make a little bit more sense when we come to look at some mock questions in a moment. But what I don't want you to do is make this final part the main focus of your question. If you can, you might maybe be able to put one sentence in as to why the source might maybe be slightly less useful, but that shouldn't make up the vast majority of your answer. The vast majority of your answer should be explaining why the sources are useful to us, not why they aren't. So, for example, mock question here: how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the causes of World War I? Source A is a drawing. It's a representation of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. We can see him here being shot along with his wife Sofia by the Black Hand terrorist Gavrilo Princip. Source B is war records taken from the German archives showing the German plans for war in 1912. You can see here the structure of your answer. You are writing 2 paragraphs. Think about it as source A is worth 4 marks and source B is worth 4 marks. You must talk about both of them. So, for example, don't just look at source A and think, oh, I think that's the easier source, so I'll just focus on that one. I won't write anything for source B, and then maybe I'll get 6 out of 8 just for writing about source A. It doesn't work that way. You have to talk about both of them. You don't need to mix them though. So 1 paragraph for A, then drop it, leave it alone and move on, and a 2nd paragraph for source B. You don't need to reach a judgment as to which is the most useful out of the 2. That's not needed, it's not necessary. Okay? So in your paragraphs, you're going to start to think about why these sources are useful. So you're thinking about content, what you can see in the picture or what you can quote from the source, why that's useful from your own knowledge. Is it showing you something that you know to be historically true? Why? What do you know? Support that with your own knowledge. Then the provenance. So again, look at the origin, look at what this source actually is, where it's come from and when. Why that's useful to you. What do you know from your own knowledge that makes that useful? And then, perhaps if you can, and again, it's not the end of the world if you can't, it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily lose marks. Could you maybe suggest why the provenance might be limited for this source? Is it perhaps restricted in the information that it can give us? If so, why? So what I want you to do now is pause me and try to answer this question. You can do it in bullet points if you want to. Use these sentence starters, but think about what you would pick from these sources and how you would answer this question. If you were in the lesson in the last week and you have already done this, what I want you to do is, I don't want you to look at your notes, I want you to see if you can do it again from memory and then compare your answer this time round to the answer that you planned in lesson. So pause me now for a couple of minutes and try to answer this question. Then we'll go over some of the points that I've got. So pause me now. Okay, so these are some of the bits that students from a lesson that I taught last week picked out, and then I typed some of them up. So these are not the be all and end all. There are other points that you could have included within your answer as well, but these are just some of the good points that we were able to pick out. So source A here, one student said, source A is useful because the content shows the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo in 1914. This is useful because I know from my own knowledge, good, link there, you should be able to see that sentence throughout your answer. I know from my own knowledge, this is useful because this event helped to cause the outbreak of World War I. Once the Duke was assassinated, it caused a domino effect, and one by one, the great powers declared war. Then they move on to provenance. The provenance is useful because it is a painting showing the event. This is useful as it shows the moment Princip runs out and shoots them, which shows me how they died. However, the provenance may be limited because it's just a representation of the event. therefore it might be slightly over-exaggerated. It's not a factual photograph, it was a painting. Okay, so some good points there. The second one, source B, students said they found this one a little bit harder than the painting of the assassination. This student said, source B is useful because the content shows the German plans for war sooner than better. So they've quoted the source, which is good. That's exactly what you should do. This is useful because I know from my own knowledge, again, good link back there, that Germany was imperialistic and wanted to create a greater Germany by invading other countries. For example, France through the Schlieffen Plan. The provenance is useful because it's from the German archives. This means that it is a record of the German plans for war, and it shows that they were planning for war 2 years before 1914. So again, a really good starting point here. They've taken out 2 quotes from the source, they've explained why that's useful, they've used their own knowledge of the historical content to then explain why the source is useful. They talk about Germany being imperialistic, and we know that is true. They talk about Germany planning for war by invading France through the Schlieffen Plan, which again we know to be true. And then they explain the provenance of the source by explaining that it was taken from the official German archives, which show the plans for war 2 years before 1914. You might have noticed that there's no information here as to why the source might be limited, like we have at the end of A here. That's absolutely fine. If you can't find something that's extremely obvious and you feel like you're just sitting there looking for something that isn't there, don't worry about it. Drop it and leave it alone. A lot of students waste a lot of time on the smaller questions at the start and they take away from their big question at the end of 16 marker, okay? If you've got information about provenance, information about content, and you've supported that with your own knowledge, then that is fine. Okay, question 2 and question 3 come as a pair. Unlike question 1, where you have looked at contemporary sources such as this, now we're moving on and we are looking at historical interpretations. So you'll need to read them. These are taken from historians showing their opinions of why World War I started. The first question you are asking is what is the difference between them? So how are they different? Then the second question you are answering about them is why they are different. Okay, so we're going to start off with question 2, then move on to question 3. So, historical interpretations, how do they differ? I normally like to explain this by kind of presenting it as a little bit of a spot the difference question. Your interpretations will not be the same, otherwise you would struggle to compare them. They will always be the opposite of each other. So they're talking about the same topic, but they're giving different opinions of that topic. So the first thing you need to do is read the interpretations and read them carefully, okay? So take your time. If you want to, annotate them a little bit, maybe highlight them, spend a couple of minutes reading them properly. It'll be helpful to you, especially for your 16 mark question as well. They're always going to be the opposite of each other, so you can compare their opinions. What you don't need to do is consider the provenance, because that's not what the question wants from you. So unlike question 1, where you talked about the fact that it might be from a newspaper, or it might be a painting, or it might be a speech, you don't need to do that now. Both of these interpretations have come from historians who are experts within their field. So you don't need to look at the date or the name or what university they went to. You don't need to worry about any of that. We can trust what these people are saying, so we're not commenting on that. Instead, you need to make clear what the difference is in terms of their opinions. So one historian is saying this, whereas the other historian is saying that. Because remember, they are opposites. So next thing you need to think about is structure. This is a 4-mark question, so you don't need to write lines and lines and lines and lines, because you are just taking away from your large question at the end. You can easily get 4 marks out of 4 through writing 4 sentences, and that's it. So first of all, these interpretations differ because one suggests blah de blah, whereas the other suggests blah de blah. So they're both going to be talking about World War I, but they're both going to argue that different things caused war. Then you need to give evidence. For example, interpretation 1 argues and give a quote, whereas interpretation 2 argues and then you give a second quote. Then you need to link back, therefore they are different because, and that would be the same sentence that you wrote for your opening sentence. One suggests this, whereas the other suggests that. So let's see if we can answer it then. Again, if you did this in lesson already, it's absolutely fine. Don't look at your notes. See if you can do this from memory. Try to memorise the structure. So the first interpretation is by Dr. Heather Jones. She says, assassinations of royal figures did not normally result in war, but Austria-Hungary's military saw the Sarajevo assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife by a Bosnian Serb as an excuse to conquer and destroy Serbia, an unstable neighbour which sought to expand beyond its borders into Austro-Hungarian territories. Serbia, exhausted by the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13, did not want another war in 1914. Austria-Hungary did. So think about what interpretation 1 is suggesting was the reason for the outbreak of World War I. Interpretation 2. Germany's military and naval leaders shared a devil-may-care militarism that made war inevitable and, like their Austrian counterparts, believed it would be better to go down fighting than to go on tolerating what they regarded as humiliating. In the spring of 1914, this small group of military men in Germany decided to make the leap into the dark and support the Austrian attack on Serbia. So, what is John Rawls suggesting was the main reason for the outbreak of World War I? So again, look closely at the interpretations and you'll see how they differ. First of all, Dr. Jones is talking clearly here about the role of Austria-Hungary and how they used the assassination of the Archduke as an excuse to destroy Serbia. So she is holding Austria-Hungary as responsible for the outbreak of World War I. Whereas John Rawls suggests Germany's military leaders made war inevitable. If something is inevitable, it means it's going to happen. You can't stop it. He goes on to say that Germany believed it was better to go down fighting than to keep on tolerating what they regarded as humiliating. And military men in Germany decided to support the Austrian attack on Serbia. So unlike Dr. Jones, who blames Austria-Hungary for the outbreak of World War I, John Rawls blames Germany, and more specifically, Germany's military leaders. Okay, so try to answer the question, think about the structure that I said before. First of all, in your opening sentence, make the difference clear. Second sentence, evidence from interpretation 1. Third sentence, evidence from interpretation 2. Final sentence, link back to what you said in your opening. Therefore, they are different because. 4 lines, 4 marks. So pause me now, give yourself 5 minutes and try to answer this. Don't use your notes from the lesson. Okay, so here's my answer. Compare your answer to what I've put and see what mark you would get out of 4. These interpretations differ on the reasons for the outbreak of World War I because one suggests that World War I was caused by Austria-Hungary and the assassination, whereas the other suggests it was caused by German militarism. For example, interpretation 1 argues the Sarajevo assassination was used as an excuse to conquer Serbia, which shows that they blame the assassination on Austria-Hungary. Whereas interpretation 2 argues German military leaders made war inevitable, which shows that they blame German militarism. Therefore, they are different because one suggests that World War I was caused by Austria-Hungary and the assassination, whereas the other suggests that it was caused by German militarism. So think about what you've put, and compare it to my answer and give yourself a mark out of 4. Okay, so the second part of this question is question 3. Historical interpretations, why do they differ? So the biggest mistake that students make with this question is they just write the same thing twice. So exactly what you've put for question 2, they just sort of write the same thing again but word it differently. You will not get a mark if you do that. Instead, we're thinking about this from a slightly different level as we have done previously. We're not just explaining what they differ on, now we are explaining why they differ. So both of these historians are experts within their field. They're both experts on World War I. However, they've both reached different conclusions for the same question. One is blaming Austria-Hungary, the other one's blaming Germany. So we need to think about why that's happened. Why is it that these two historical experts have reached different conclusions on the same topic? What you need to think about is the reason why they differ is because they've got different perspectives of history. And the reason why they've got different perspectives of history is because they've used different pieces of evidence to reach their judgment. So one of them has looked at evidence focused on a certain topic, whereas the other historian has looked at different types of evidence, which has allowed them to reach their judgment. Again, you're not focusing on the provenance. Don't want to see anybody writing anything along the lines of, well, this one was written at this time, therefore it might not be reliable. That's not what it wants you to do. Instead, what have they focused on? Where have they gained this evidence? Consider the sources that you used in question 1, where you had to explain why the sources were useful. Okay? So this is a little tip here, and I'll go over this in a little bit more detail, but this is where you can kind of almost cheat the question a little bit, because you can go back and use the sources that you've already used from question 1. So your layout is very similar to what it was in question 2. Opening sentence needs to explain why they are different. These interpretations are different because they focus on different perspectives of history, because they've used different evidence. That's your opening sentence. Then, same as the previous one, for example, the writer of Interpretation 1 has researched, and then you would explain where Interpretation 1 has got their evidence from. Whereas the writer of Interpretation 2 has researched, and again, they're the wrong way around, I'll change them later, and again, explain the evidence where Interpretation 2 has got their opinion from. And same again, your final sentence links back to almost exactly the same as what you said in your opening sentence. Therefore, they're different because they focus on different perspectives of history, they've used different evidence. And this is where you can use your sources to help you. So, if you look at the question, I know that's quite small, but it's up here in the top, you'll notice that it does actually mention the sources you've already used. Suggest one reason why Interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the reasons for the outbreak of World War I. You may use sources A and B to help you explain your answer. Now, it's not doing that as a trick, it's doing that to help you. It's saying, if you can, use the sources in your answer. So don't forget about that. You will be able to match up the historical interpretations to the contemporary sources that we used for question 1. They match up. They're a pair. Dr. Heather Jones has argued that Austria-Hungary's military saw the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo as an excuse to start war. And if you look back at source A, what is source A? It's a representation of the assassination. So clearly, the writer of Interpretation 1 has studied evidence from source A, which is why she has reached the judgment that she has reached, because this is showing the assassination of the Archduke, which is why she then goes on to explain that Austria-Hungary used the assassination as an excuse to start war. Exactly the same for Interpretation 2. Professor John Roll is talking about Germany's military, that their leaders made war inevitable, they wanted to go down fighting, they took a leap into the dark. And you'll notice that source B is all about the German plans for war. It talks about the fact that Germany held a war council in 1912, Germany were planning for war, the leader of the German army said war sooner than better. It showed Germany's plans for establishing a greater Germany, that they were only going to accomplish that by going to war with both France and Russia, and that Germany had been planning war for years. B matches interpretation 2. So on your exam paper, you should be able to see the lines and match them up. Interpretation 1 has looked at B, interpretation 2 has looked at A, and so on. So you should be able to do that. Therefore, these two historians have reached different judgments on the same question. Why did World War I break out? Because they have looked at different pieces of evidence. Therefore, their perspectives in history differ. Okay, so this can be quite a tricky question, but I want you to give it a go. Suggest one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the reasons for the outbreak of World War I. You may use sources A and B to help you. So, answer this question in this box here. Again, don't use your notes from your lesson. If you were in the lesson, try to give it a go, and then I'll go through the answers. Okay, so pause me now, give yourself 5 minutes. Okay, so answers. Here. The reason why these interpretations differ on the reasons for the outbreak of World War I is because they have both focused on differing perspectives of history and they've used different evidence. For example, interpretation 1 has used evidence from source A, which shows the assassination of the Archduke, which is why they blame the assassination on Austria-Hungary for causing the war. Whereas interpretation 2 has used evidence from source B, which shows the role of the German military leaders in causing the war, which is why they blame German militarism. Therefore, these interpretations differ on the reasons for the outbreak of World War I because they both focus on different perspectives of history and they've used different evidence. So they match. Interpretation 1 matches source A, interpretation 2 matches source B. So as long as you can match them, you should be able to answer this question quite easily. Okay, so we're going to move on to our last question. So this is your big question, this is your 16 marker. So again, you are using the interpretations that you've used for the previous 2 questions, so you should be quite familiar with them now. Quite a lot of students often ask, well, why can I not just start with my 16 marker because that's out of the most marks? I wouldn't recommend that you do that because you'll have used the interpretations and the sources for the 3 previous questions. So by the time you get to question 4, you should be sort of relatively used to what the interpretations are saying now. Whereas you kind of start with this bigger question, you're sort of going in cold. So it makes sense to do smaller questions first, get used to what the interpretations are saying, then you'll be more comfortable with using them for your big question at the end. So the question is, how far do you agree with interpretation 1 about the reasons for the outbreak of World War I? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your own knowledge of the historical context. So this is really similar to the assessment question that you completed in school with me, where you were given a question, imperialism was the main cause of World War I, you planned your answer, and then you were given a certain amount of time to write that up. It's very similar to this, however, we're using historical interpretations instead of contemporary sources that we used last time. The structure is the same. You must have an introduction with a line of argument. You must present your opinion and you must do so clearly. First of all, you need to tell me what interpretation 1 actually says. By this point, you'll know exactly what interpretation 1 says because you've used it in 2 of the questions. Interpretation 1 suggests that the main cause of World War I was Austria-Hungary and the assassination. Then, tell me to what extent you agree with that. You fully agree. You agree with interpretation 1 that Austria-Hungary was the main cause of World War I, or you fully disagree. You do not agree with the statement. You believe that something else was a more important cause. Or you partially agree. You think that that was important, but there was also other important factors as well. You need to make that clear within your introduction. Your introduction shouldn't be huge. A few sentences is fine as long as your opinion, your line of argument is crystal clear. Don't just say, I don't agree with interpretation 1, full stop. It's not enough. You need to tell me why. Then within your answer, you must have evidence to agree with interpretation 1, including quotes from interpretation 1 and your own knowledge. Then you must have evidence to disagree with interpretation 1, which is where you would bring in interpretation 2 and use quotes from that and your own knowledge. And then finally, a conclusion. That should match your introduction. Your line of argument should flow all the way through. There shouldn't be any jumping back and forth. 1 minute you agree, 1 minute you disagree. You need to have your argument rock solid and it should not change. Okay, so this is how I like to get year 9s to kind of think about their answer. I like to get them to kind of imagine it as being hands. On the one hand, I agree. On the other hand, I disagree. And then think about how the interpretations would kind of come off this. So, first of all, your introduction. So this is my introduction to the question. This is my line of argument. Interpretation 1 suggests that the main cause of World War I was Austria-Hungary and the assassination of the Archduke. Whilst I agree that the assassination was the event that started World War I partially disagree with the statement, as I believe that other long-term factors were more important, for example, nationalism. So I've addressed interpretation 1, I've explained what interpretation 1 thinks, I've also explained my view on interpretation 1, and then I've given my line of argument. My line of argument is clear. The assassination was important, but other long-term factors such as nationalism were more important, okay? Then we're going to go into interpretation 1 first, then interpretation 2, and then our conclusion at the end. So first of all, on the one hand, you need to start with evidence to agree with interpretation 1. You are going to use evidence from interpretation 1, such as quotes, and then your own knowledge to either support or challenge that interpretation. You must use quotes. You must be seen as engaging with the interpretation, or you're going to really struggle to make your way up the mark scheme. So, the reason why I like to set this out on hands is because I like to think about multiple quotes. So, the main body of your argument is going here in the palm of your hand, and then your quotes are coming off the fingers at the side. So a couple of quotes that I picked out from interpretation 1 that I think are quite good, that I think I could either challenge or support quite well. First quote is, Austria-Hungary's military saw the Sarajevo assassination by a Bosnian Serb as an excuse to conquer and destroy Serbia. I think I'm going to use that. This one's another good one as well. Serbia, an unstable neighbour which sought to expand beyond its borders into Austro-Hungarian territories. Again, another good quote. I think I might use that. And then this one here. Serbia, exhausted by the 2 Balkan Wars, did not want another war in 1914. Austria-Hungary did. So they're just some of the quotes that I think I can support and challenge well with my own knowledge. The structure of your paragraphs are exactly the same as how we've been practicing in class and at home, some of your homework. Point, evidence, explain, link back. So the structure is no different from anything that we've been using before, okay? So this is what a paragraph should look like. Point, evidence, explain, link. And you can see, you can match them up to the different colours, just how much I'm writing for each part. So first of all, my point linked to the question. Interpretation 1 suggests there is evidence to support that Austria-Hungary was responsible for the outbreak of war. That's my point. Then I need to use evidence, which is a quote from Interpretation 1. This is the quote I've picked. Interpretation 1 argues, Austria-Hungary's military saw the Sarajevo assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke by a Bosnian Serb as an excuse to conquer and destroy Serbia. And you can see the quotation marks that I've put in there. So that is my evidence that I've taken from Interp 1. Now you can see that I'm writing quite a little bit more in red and purple. That is because I'm using red, I'm explaining using my own specific knowledge of the events and the time period to analyse interpretation 1. And then purple, the link back to my line of argument, is also a little bit more in depth as well. So this is how you balance out your paragraphs well. You make your point short and sharp. You pick out a quote. Again, you don't need to pick out loads and loads of different quotes. You don't need to rewrite the entire paragraph. I've just got one short sentence here, and then the vast majority of your paragraph should be analysing that quote using your knowledge of what happened. So I've then said, in October 1809, Austria annexed Bosnia into the Austro-Hungarian Empire and cut them off from their Serbian brothers who had hoped to create a new Slavic nation together. For many reasons, the annexation caused quite a stir in Europe as the move was not fully legal. Austria-Hungary developed an inflated opinion of her strength in Europe. Therefore, when Serbia got her revenge with the assassination of the Archduke in 1914, Austria-Hungary did use this relatively minor event to attack and attempt to destroy Serbia completely. So I've used this quote, I've backed it up with my own knowledge, and I've said that actually I do agree with that quote there, that the assassination of the Archduke was a good excuse to try and conquer Serbia, who had been difficult and had challenged the authority of Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary decided to try and stamp on Serbia. I then link back to my line of argument here. The feeling of national pride and strength made Austria-Hungary keen for war against Serbia, who had openly attacked them. However, the role of Austria-Hungary was not the only important factor in the cause of World War I. There were other long-term reasons that contributed to the outbreak in a more important way. For example, nationalism across Europe. And I've closed the loop there. I've taken it back, if I just skip back a few slides, I've taken it back to my introduction here, where I've said that other long-term factors such as nationalism were more important. So that's tick, my introduction done, and then tick, evidence to agree, done. If you feel like you can write more, so that's just one paragraph for example, you might be able to do another paragraph on interpretation 1, where you pick out a slightly different quote and then again you explain it with your own knowledge. As we saw from the hand here, there's quite a few good quotes that you could use from interpretation 1, so keep your eye on the time. If you feel like you can write more than one paragraph, write more than one paragraph. You are not limited to just one, but your structure will be exactly the same. Further evidence from interpretation 1 shows this. You'd give a different quote. Again, you would explain that quote using your own specific own knowledge, and again, you would link back to the main focus of the question, your line of argument. Now, the other side, your other hand. We've done our introduction, we've done our evidence to talk about interpretation 1. Now we must talk about evidence in interpretation 2. You must talk about both of them. Again, I've done the same thing. I've gone through interpretation 2 and I've picked out some really good quotes. So, good quotes I've got here. Germany's military and naval leaders made war inevitable. Another quote. Germany believed it would be better to go down fighting than to go on tolerating what they regarded as humiliating. And a third and final quote. Germany took the leap into the dark and supported the Austro attack on Serbia. So you could use any of those quotes. You're using them in exactly the same fashion as before. Evidence from the interpretation, your own knowledge to challenge or support that interpretation. So again, your paragraph could look like this. My point. On the other hand, interpretation 2 disagrees with the argument that Austria-Hungary was responsible for the outbreak of war, as it instead suggests that German militarism was to blame. That's my point. Now I need to give some evidence to back that up. Interpretation 2 argues Germany's military and naval leaders made war inevitable, as German leaders believed it would be better to go down fighting than to go on tolerating what they regarded as humiliating. And again, just the same as the first paragraph, you can see here how I've got quite a lot more for red and purple than I do for my first two, and that's just the way it should be. Lots of your own knowledge to support or challenge this. So, I go on to say, Germany had not industrialised on the same rate as Great Britain, and therefore felt behind in comparison to her European neighbours. This caused tensions and jealousy, especially over foreign land and trade. Germany was humiliated during the crisis in Morocco in 1905 and 1911. Germany sent a warship, the Panther, into Agadir in support of Moroccan independence from France. Great Britain came to France's support, and Germany backed down once she received stern warnings. Embarrassed and bitter about the imperial lands of Great Britain and France, Germany started to invest greatly in her military. The size of Germany's standing army doubled over a short period of time, and military leaders created plans for war in 1912 in the hope that she could take over lands in the west and east. And now I'm going to link back to the main focus of the question and my argument. Therefore, it was not just the role of Austria-Hungary that helped cause the outbreak of World War I, but other reasons such as German militarism. However, Germany invested in her armed forces. Invested in her armed forces so she could compete imperialistically with Great Britain. Nationalist feeling in Germany was new in comparison to other countries, and this was demonstrated by Germany's early plans for war in the hopes that she would conquer new lands like her European neighbours. In conclusion, it was European nationalism that was the real cause of World War I. And I close the loop with a decent conclusion. So tick, I've given my introduction. Tick, I've agreed with the statement and used interpretation 1. Tick, I've disagreed with the statement and I've used interpretation 2, and now I need to finish off with a conclusion. In conclusion, whilst I agree that the assassination was an important event that caused World War I, I partially disagree with the statement, as I believe that other long-term factors, like nationalism, were more important, or most important, sorry. Without the strong nationalistic feelings held by the European powers, then countries would not have been so quick or so keen to declare war on each other in the hopes of taking over new territories. And I've linked back to the main focus of the question, and I've closed the loop there with my line of argument. Okay, so that is your exam prep. That's what all of your questions are going to look like. Obviously, they're not the interpretations or the sources you're going to get, but they're going to be quite similar, and that's your structure. So it might be worth now, you may be taking a little bit of a break, and then we are going to start doing some revision. So if you want, feel free to pause me now, have a little bit of a break, and come back. Right, okay, so we did our World War I flashcards in class. If you missed that lesson, I'm going to put this on Teams for you so you can go through it. Basically, everybody got a stapled pack of these blank flashcards. They then completed these flashcards using their own knowledge, completely from memory with no book, and then we went through the points together and they added anything they missed. So if you were off when we did these World War I flashcards, I will put this on Teams for you to create at your own time, and then I'll put the information on as well that you can add. Secondly, I've also put on Teams something called a look, cover, write, check. So this is what it should look like on your Teams page. You've got, it's a table showing Germany, Britain, France, and then it's split again under nationalism, militarism and imperialism. The alliance system is not on there. What you do is you set a timer on your phone, 5 minutes, you read all of this information, read it again and again and again and again and again until your timer goes off. Then you try to complete this table from memory. Some of you were given this table, some of you weren't. So some of you might actually have this blank table already stuck in your book. If you don't have it, don't worry, you can just draw the table out. You cover up the information, you set another 5 minutes on your phone. Within that 5 minutes, you try to write down everything that you can remember from memory. So you're covering the information and you're writing it down. Then when your phone beeps again after another 5 minutes, You get the information back up, and in a different colour you add anything that you missed. So that is your look, cover, write check. That is also on Teams. What I'm going to do with you is something slightly different. We haven't done this in class. Quite a few of you, when marking your assessment and speaking to you generally, were saying that you were struggling a lot with nationalism. Quite a few of you said that you understood what nationalism was, but you didn't feel like you could write as much for it in comparison to alliances, for example. I would argue that actually nationalism was crucial in World War I. So what I wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time going back over nationalism, recapping what it means, and giving you some examples. So the best way, I think, for you to set this up is to do it as a mind map. So nationalism across Europe in the middle of your mind map. Then some of the key parts to come off there would be Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, minorities in Eastern Europe, e.g. Slavic groups in the Balkans, and then Britain and France. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some key information with you, and you can sort of listen to me and pause me and then add to your mind map as we go through. So, I mean, if you've got an A3 piece of paper, do it on A3. If not, do it in your book over a double page, because there's going to be lots and lots of bits to get down. I'm going to read the information to you. I'll put it as a slide on the PowerPoint and read it over to you, and then you can add to it in notes on your mind map. So what I'm not expecting you to do is to just rewrite all of this out, because it'll take you forever and you won't remember it all. You're going to listen to the points that I'm making, and then you're going to make notes of them. So they look a little bit like that, shortened down notes on particular sections. Okay, so pause me now and get the key points coming off your mind map, and then we will start going through nationalism. Okay, so pause me now, and I'm also just going to quickly get a drink because my throat is starting to dry up. Right, I'm back. Sorry, I haven't quite figured out how to pause the recording. I'm not overly good with technology, as I'm sure you've all grasped. Right, okay, quick recap then. What actually is nationalism? What are some of the key facts to remember when you're thinking about nationalism? Nationalism can be defined as a deep sense of patriotism, so an extreme love of your country. But it's not just a love of your country in particular. It's a feeling and a sense of pride that means that you love your country so much that you place your country above other nations. You believe that you are superior, better, that you should and could conquer others if you want to or need to. And it was this nationalistic feeling that made countries almost want war in some respect, because they believed that war was good for nations. Pre-war nationalism was fueled by imperialism. So remember, imperialism is the want to take over foreign lands to add to your empire, but it was also fueled by politics and the economy. British nationalism was characterised by a century of relative peace and prosperity. The British Empire had rapidly expanded its territories, predominantly in Africa and Asia, mainly because of its naval strength. So remember that Britain dominated the seas and had the largest navy in the world, and that helped her to maintain her strong empire. Britain was known for having successful colonial wars, so being able to invade and take over other countries abroad and then add them into her empire. So that's something that's been going on for a long time, whereas something that was quite new was German nationalism. So this is not like 100-year-long worth of British nationalism. German nationalism was new, so it was a new sensation. It was sweeping across Germany. The reason why this is new is because Germany was only unified in 1871. That means that Germany used to be a collection of lots of independent states, but actually they all come together, they unify under one leader, the Kaiser, the King of Germany. And once they unify, they create a sense of nationalism as well. And Germany becomes obsessed with imperial expansion and wanting to copy the British Empire. German nationalists were resentful of the British and their empire. They wanted the same thing, and they were frustrated that Brits were seen as being sort of in a positive light in terms of her empire, but then when Germany tried to do the same thing, she was perceived as being a bully, like we saw in Morocco. Nationalism was also experienced in parts of southern Europe, where some of the ethnic minorities wanted autonomy and independence. If you're an autonomous nation, that means that you have the right to rule and govern yourself. And a lot of these southern European nations were fed up of being governed and ruled by others, especially from the Austro-Hungarian empires. So we're talking about the Balkans here and the growing nationalism in those states. So if you're unsure what nationalism is, they're just some of the key facts you might want to pop some of those down on your mind map. Now, if you look here, I'm going to be going through loads of information. You are not just writing all of this down, because that is not how revision works. You will not remember it. Instead, listen to what I'm saying, pause me at different time periods and write down the key facts coming off these countries. So look here how much I've written for Germany as an example. It's short, sharp information that when you come to do your exam in a week's time, you'll think, aha, yes, I can remember, I wrote that down. Copying just doesn't work. Right, so let's get going. Nationalism was very common in the early 20th century in Europe, and it's considered as being a significant cause of World War I. Before the war, most Europeans believed in having some sort of cultural, economic, military supremacy and dominance over other nations. What that basically means is that a lot of the European superpowers believed that their country was supreme, it was the best, the most important, it had power over others. This was fueled by really provocative, emotive speeches, propaganda posters, front pages of newspapers were often headlined by nationalistic rhetoric, exaggerated stories, rumours of rival nations, threats, invasions, horrible intentions, other evil empires and evil leaders that were going to come and take away from your country. That feeling of threat and fear often played into nationalists' hands. Nationalism was also significantly present in pop culture. It influenced literature, theatre, music. It was also encouraged by leaders as well, such as royal families, politicians, diplomats. They made no attempt to stop nationalism. In fact, some actively encouraged it. So again, that's just nationalism in terms of everyday society across Europe. These trends of nationalism also gave citizens overconfidence in their nation, governments, and their military strength. It gave them a false sense of fairness and righteousness. It demonised rival nations, portrayed them as aggressive, shrewd, deceitful, barbaric, uncivilised. Citizens now considered rival nations as threats who were plotting and scheming against them. This was mainly done by emphasising the negatives brought about by imperialism. Nationalists were convinced that if a war between rivals ever broke out, then they would be victorious. So why not? War is good for nations, and war will be good for us. That's what a lot of countries thought. Imperialism, militarism, and nationalism contributed towards a continental delusion that European war just seemed winnable, that it was the right thing to do, so why not? Because we'll win. There wasn't a lot of understanding as to what would happen if they didn't win. It was just understood that they would. So why not? Because it'll be good for us. And that's at the heart of nationalism, this over-exaggerated sense of your own importance and your own power. 19th century was of comparative peace in Europe, apart from some of the wars such as Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War, which we've talked about. Citizens of England and France were used to colonial wars, which were often fought against underdeveloped and under-equipped opponents in Africa and Asia. These wars had often been wrapped up quickly because of their superiority over the military aspects of these countries. France, however, was defeated by the Prussians in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War, which again we've talked about in lessons. Most of these nations considered Europe's great powers that had not experienced a significant military defeat for more than half a century, and consequently felt invincible. So other than France, that lost in the Franco-Prussian War, a lot of the other European superpowers just hadn't been defeated in war for a very, very long time. Therefore, if you had never been defeated, you would feel like the champion. You would feel like no one could conquer you. And for instance, the Brits believed that their naval power and their economic might would give them the upper hand against any opposition in any type of war. Brits thought that we would be victorious. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to that. If you want to just pause that and leave it on so you can get some bits down without me talking, feel free. I'll leave it on for 5 seconds and I'll go to the next slide. Right, next one. The Germans had confidence in their military efficiency and precision, and their growing industrial base. They had new armaments, they had an expanding fleet of battleships and submarines. You should know the name of the particular types of battleships that they were building. It was in competition with Great Britain's battleships. It begins with a D. If you can't remember it, try to remember it. If not, look it up, but that is something you should know. If a war was to occur, the Germans had confidence in their Schlieffen Plan, which was a military strategy for defeating Germany's eastern and western neighbours by fighting Russia and France on different fronts at different times. This is something that they had planned before 1914. In Russia, the Tsar, who was the king of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, believed his throne and empire had been sent to him by God, and that Russia's incredibly large standing army of 1.5 million would protect them. This army was the largest peacetime land force in Europe. So out of all of the European superpowers, Russia had the largest standing army. Remember though, that a lot of her enemies underestimated her, and they believed that even though she had the largest standing army, they believed that Russia was a backward country, that she would be slow to mobilise, so therefore they didn't see Russia as much as a big threat of comparison to some other countries. In addition, a wall of concrete fortresses and defences running the length of the eastern border was basically the protection that France had created. She was fairly sure that Germany would try to attack her through their shared land borders, so she placed these concrete barriers and defences to protect her, and she had full confidence that they would withstand any form of German attack. Most European powers had grown almost drunk with patriotism. I think that's a really good way to describe it. And nationalism by the late 1800s. Britain, for example, by this time had enjoyed 2 centuries of imperial, commercial and naval dominance. The British Empire spanned 1/4 of the globe, mainly through colonies it had set up all around the world. They believed that they could never be slaves to anyone, hence the famous song that you'll see in your look cover right check. However, the unification of Germany in 1871, the speed of German armament and the self-righteousness of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was becoming an increasing concern to British nationalists. So they were keeping their eye on Germany. They weren't too sure what she was up to or whether they should trust what Germany was doing. And they certainly didn't enjoy the attitude of Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the king of Germany. he was very imperialistic, and Britain found that to be quite threatening. So nationalists in Britain were keeping a very watchful eye of nationalists in Germany. German militarism greatly backed their nationalism. The strength of the nation was purely defined and reflected by the strength of its military forces. The new Kaiser, who had been made the leader of the German nation as a whole, was synonymous with his country. He was young, enthusiastic, nationalistic, obsessed with military power and imperial expansion, which is what the rest of the country wanted too. Wilhelm was proud of Germany's achievements, but uncertain about its future. The main obstacle in his mind was Britain's expansion. The British soon became a popular target for the German press, and Britain was painted as expansionist, selfish, greedy, obsessed with money. So Germany looked at Great Britain and thought, they've got what we want, Great Britain's not willing to share, that makes Great Britain selfish and greedy and expansionist, and that's what we want too, so we need to kind of emulate that and copy that. As the great powers flexed their might and filled their people with a sense of righteousness and superiority, another form of nationalism was emerging, but in a different part of Europe this time. Now we're going to move to the southern part of Europe. This is a different kind of nationalism. It's not about supremacy or military power like we see with Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, but instead, this is a type of militarism which is more about the right of different ethnic groups to be independent. This came about because the world was divided into large empires. Many regions, races and religious groups wanted to be free from imperialism. They didn't want to be tied down by the restrictions of whoever owned them. They wanted to be their own independent state. A good example of this is in Russia. More than 80 different ethnic groups were formed. Hang on, I've lost my place now. Many different... Where's it gone? Oh, here. In Russia, more than 80 different ethnic groups in Eastern Europe and Asia were forced to speak Russian, recognise the Russian Tsar as their leader and practice Russian religion. This eventually led to the Russian Revolution and saw the end of the Russian royal family and the murder of the Tsar family. So it's this build-up of wanting to be free and govern yourself. And this also has a different impact elsewhere. The nationalist movement that had the biggest impact was the outbreak of war by the Slavic groups in the Balkans. Pan-Slavism was a belief that the Slavic people of Eastern Europe should be independent. They should have their own nation, that they were powerful in force in their region. It was predominantly Serbia where it had risen significantly by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Pan-Slavism was mainly opposed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the control and influence that it had over that region. Discontent was on a high, and young Serbs joined radical nationalist groups like the Black Hand Gang that we've talked a lot about, mostly because of Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So remember, we've talked about that, where Austria-Hungary split off Bosnia from Serbia and took Bosnia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which wasn't a technically legal move, and it caused a big stir across Europe and caused an awful lot of unhappiness. That then promotes a nationalistic movement where people feel like they should rise up and fight back for their independence. So because of that split, groups like the Black Hand Gang wanted to drive Austria-Hungary from the Balkans to form a nation called a Greater Serbia. And this was an intensified form of nationalism that actually caused the start of World War I through the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo in 1914 by the Black Hand Gang. So as you can see, even though nationalism might be slightly harder to explain in comparison to some of the other parts of Maine, actually nationalism was crucial when thinking about the start of World War I. So use the information that I've talked about today and add it to the mind map that you should have made on nationalism. If you want anything else from me, or if you want me to explain something in a little bit more detail, then please email me throughout the course of the week and I will help you where I can, okay? So thanks for listening, and I'll see you when we get back after half term.